We ended off the last video talking about how you could enable and disable an item granter so it stops working for everyone in certain points during the match, but what if you only want it to stop working for certain players, or you want it to do different things depending on who activates it, or depending on maybe something else they've done earlier in the match, what they have in their inventory, or even something like how many points they have in your game. This is all achievable through creative devices, and most of the time the trick is having sort of a middleman. What you effectively need to do is relay a signal through an intermediate device. And a really simple example would be a trigger. If I go onto this item granter, it has a receiving players option, but it doesn't have any filters for like which team can activate it, which class can activate it, or anything like that. So one easy thing to do is to take a trigger or an attribute trigger, and there are even some other devices that'll work for this if you don't want to put if you aren't already using a trigger or an attribute trigger. They're called attribute evaluators now. But instead of linking the button directly to the granter, let's say we want one team, delete that. Let's say we want one team to get the lever and one team to get the havoc, right? What we'll do is this button will transmit to the trigger instead of transmitting directly to the item granter. And then this will send to the granter. So this activates that, and then this activates this. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put a team filter on this, or how about a class filter? How about class 1 gets a havoc and class 2 gets a lever? So then what we're gonna do, since I want to do as little event binding as possible, is we're gonna do the trick from last video. We're gonna be very clever about it. I'm gonna delete this. Copy those, so it'll make a new link between the havoc granter and the trigger. And then we take this one, set it to class 2. So that's one easy trick. And if you're using an attribute evaluator, even have you can even have player score as your condition. And of course there is activating team. The main thing that makes a trigger unique though is the number of ways that can trigger it. If you look through this, you can literally throw an item at it, or have it get activated by a sequencer, or by rising water. One that I use for every map, pretty much, no, literally every map, is the conditional button. These things are amazing. A lot of people will just use these. You could use this as your button, right? Basically what it does is it adds a material cost to the transmission. And yeah, conditional buttons are different in that they don't necessarily have to be the middleman. They can be the activator. We could replace this button with a conditional button and then add a material cost just by dropping whatever we want in here. Say some gold. And then you just have to set how much gold you want it to cost. You can use these as an intermediate as well though, because while they can be directly activated by the player, you can also remotely activate them, just like we did with these triggers here. And they don't actually have to delete the items from your inventory as it does by default. You can turn off consume key items, and it will kind of just check for which items you have. And you have two different transmitters here. One for if they do have the items, one for if they don't. And that makes it super useful for a lot of different situations. And especially like more complex mechanics that kind of manipulate player items. Now, conditional buttons and triggers are cool and all, but if you really want to have full control over effectively enabling and disabling things for individual players or teams at a certain time and things of that nature, what you want is either trackers or switches. Trackers have a large down payment, so you might not want to use them unless you're going to be using some of their other functions, like being able to keep track of all of these different things. But each one you put down costs half the memory of a switch. For this purpose, though, they're basically interchangeable, so I'll walk you through how to use both. Alright, so for this example, I want to try a different kind of activation, and this is a good thing to know how to do. I see a lot of people who don't know how to use these, just kind of plop them in their maps and expect them to do something, and that would be the signal remote. To get this thing to work, you need a device called the signal remote manager, and you want to plop that down, and here you get to choose like what the item activates. So we got our blue signal remote here, and we're going to make it activate something different depending on whether you're in this quad crasher or not. And for that, we'll need a tracker or a switch. We'll use a switch first. The idea with switches is that you can turn them on or off for individual players without affecting the other player's switch. So everybody kind of has their own separate state on the switch. And to make sure that works correctly, turn on store state per player. If you don't turn the setting on, it gets to be really weird, so do it. And you'll need to turn on persistence to even like access it, which is odd because persistence is about saving stuff between rounds, but this can affect how the switch works just within a game without even having to like save anything between rounds. Okay, the next thing is to have the signal remote check the switch state. That's how it's going to work. And the switch will turn on whenever someone gets in the quad crasher and turn off when someone gets out of it. So then it'll check, it's basically checking to see whether they're in the quad crasher. And then we have two different events for whether it's on or off. Alright, so I don't know about you guys, but I'm thinking we do a custom sword I made in the melee manager for when you're not in the vehicle, and we will do bottle rockets for when you are in the vehicle, so you can throw them on the back and start just absolutely bombing people in the quad crasher. Alright, so we got it granting the bottle rockets when it's on, and and granting the sword if it's off, checking on the signal remote, and then turning on and off depending on whether the player is in the quad crasher or out of it. So let's get a signal remote, start the game, and see how it goes. I think I messed up the signal remote. Guys. Sometimes I will spend 15 minutes debugging and realize that the device was just disabled. This is the worst feeling if you're a creative map maker. This is like almost as bad as just getting something griefed by a 5-year-old. It's just having one of your devices be disabled. It's not even that your mechanic wasn't working. The thing just wasn't. It just wasn't enabled. You just didn't turn it on, bro. Alright, so it's giving me the sword. And if I'm on here, let's get on the back. Oh, dang it, I activated secondary. Okay, we got our bottle rockets. Now we're gonna... Let's go. This is how we do it. But this thing's about to blow up. Obviously, you might wanna if your player is gonna have a full inventory, you might want to make it remove the signal remote, and you could do that with a conditional button. And you don't even have to have the conditional button activate something. You might think it'd be better to just use an item remover, and they're cool because they don't have a you don't have to pay extra memory for the first one you place, which is nice. But conditional buttons actually cost less than item removers. So a lot of times what you want to do is just have a conditional button that doesn't transmit on anything, but just activate it to remove the items. Let's say you had a timer to give you your remote back, right? You can just drop your remote in this conditional button, not even set up anything for the events here, and it'll just take it out of your inventory whenever you remotely activate it. You could do that. Activates when you press the signal remote. And then we could, of course, set up a timer and then set up a granter to give you back your remote, and then another conditional button to take away whatever item it gave you when the timer's done. And that's basically how I do most of my abilities in my maps. Now that we're getting into trackers, I wanted to talk a bit more about instigators. Because these item granters, like, you could have a ton of people in your game, and these guys are gonna need to know what to grant to. And basically how they figure that out is they know who pushed the button, and then that information actually goes through the trigger, because if you activated the button, then you activated the trigger, right? And then if you activated the trigger, then you activated the item granter, basically. So it'll relay the instigator through and then give you the Havoc shotgun. Now the nice thing about trackers is that can actually take a single instigator and make it and turn it into an instigating team. Now the cool thing with trackers is they have this setting called sharing. With the Switch, you had it turning on and off for individual players, but you can have a tracker assign or remove for an entire team or just for everybody. And then when the tracker completes, it will transmit for everyone in that group. So you could have everybody be the instigator on a tracker, or like an entire team. Okay, so for another example, let's say you have a bunch of let's say you have kind of a boss fight, right? And you have to defeat this golden sentry, or this golden brute. And you have your team, right? And you want them to be able to get out of there only when they finish the when they beat the zombie. So the trick for that is we're gonna have a button and it's gonna have to teleport your entire team. So we're gonna get a teleporter device, but this thing can only teleport one player at a time. So what we're gonna need is, let's say if the max team size is 4, we're gonna need 4 teleporters. Basically, we're just gonna need 1 teleporter for every possible like player that could be on the team. So let's say we have 4, and we'll have a zombie. Make it a mega brute. Just 1. And this is how you have an event for killing like a certain type of zombie. Normally if you put an elimination manager down, you can just like drop some items in it and they'll drop whenever you eliminate a player, right? And then you can add events for when you pick up those items or when you eliminate a player. But you can change the target type so that it actually only affects zombies or even like certain types of zombies. So you could have this only activate with a mega brute. Then we're going to use this on elimination. You can see in the description it says it triggers the channel when an elimination occurs with the eliminating actor as the instigator. So that means whoever killed the brute is gonna be the instigator. And it'll only happen when they kill a mega brute. The whole point of the elimination manager here is that it's going to assign our tracker. The tracker is going to be our middleman between using the button and activating the teleporters, because the tracker is it's going to complete when you hit the button, but it'll only be assigned for your team if one of you has killed the mega brute, because then it'll assign it for everybody. Then of course you want to make sure it doesn't assign on game start or joining in progress, because then they'll just be able to click the button immediately without even killing the mega brute. You want this to only assign on, you only want this to assign when they eliminate it. Let's pull up the elimination manager, and it was on elimination, because then they'll be the instigator. This is sometimes necessary when you're using the tracker multiple times, but it doesn't always reset itself when it completes, as it should. So sometimes you just have to force it to by having it reset when it completes. And then of course your tracker is going to complete when they activate this new button we just placed down. But obviously you can only complete it if it's assigned. Now we're not going to have this button transmit directly to the teleporters, because then it would also work, but when you haven't even killed the Mega Brute yet. We're going to have, since we have the button completing the tracker, we're then going to have the tracker teleport the players. And one thing to know with the teleporters, if you're just using these for remote activations, turn off your groups and your target groups. The other good thing is to turn off visibility with these, because you don't want to deceive the players into thinking they can go back through, unless of course they can, but that's your choice as the map creator. Now, I think it's time for us to make our little dungeon. Okay, maybe we're not doing a dungeon. Maybe we're just doing like a thing. It's so dark in here. It needs a giant ominous red light. We don't want this spawning multiple Mega Brutes, just one is fine for now. Get ourselves a weapon. Let's have it teleport there. This is why you check your device names, guys. I just realized this button isn't doing anything. Oftentimes, if the tracker is just supposed to be working in the background, I'll just turn off the HUD like that. But here, I think it'd be good to have just a little title like, press the button to escape. Because this will assign, they'll see it on their screen after they kill the Mega Brute. The target value is useful if you're gonna have something like, it's really useful if you're using any of these, right? Like this will be, if you were to have it be eliminations just for like anyone, this would be how many eliminations you would need to complete it, or how many points you need to score, or how many props you need to break, or shield potions you need to drink, or whatever. Anyways, I think it's time to try our boss fight. Guys, I don't know what's going on. It's spawning me here, but there's no spawn pad. Like, am I tripping? Whoa. All I did was go back to hub. Okay. Give me my drum gun. Die. Bam. Wait, the sword does like nothing. It's so bad. Take that. Let's go. Alright. You see how it doesn't work 2 times in a row? That's the thing about trackers that makes them a bit different from switches. If you want the tracker to be able to keep going off after you turn it on, you need to make the tracker assign itself after it completes. Because it doesn't just turn on like a switch. It assigns and then you complete it and it's gone. But it's really easy to just make the tracker assign itself if you want them to be able to still, One last thing I wanted to mention, teleport out of there multiple times after they've beaten the boss. Trackers and switches also have persistence, which is really nice. You can turn this on and then have the tracker autosave. And then if you set it to assign itself, whenever it completes, it will always remember that they've beaten this boss, and it will let them teleport out of this room whenever they come here in the game, because it will save between sessions. One last thing I wanted to mention that does something similar to these other devices is actually the mutator zone. Because there's something interesting about the on-player entering zone function. You'd think, well, this just activates every time the player enters the zone. But what if the zone enters the player? Ayo, if the zone enters the player, this will still go off. What I mean by that is that you can, let's say you just make this a 100 by 100 zone, right? And then of course, turn off VFX for smoothness, and turn on weapon fire so you're not randomly stopping people from shooting their guns. But you could have this be turned off on game start, and then enable it, and it will transmit for all the valid players who are inside of the zone for this event. And you can set filters on it just like you can with the triggers. And it's cool because you don't have to set this to just like cover the whole map. And you can resize it if you do, just like it's basically the whole map now, maybe a bit more. But you can limit the zone size, and then it'll only transmit depending on like where people are. And if you don't want people to just be able to walk into it and set it off, you can even do a small trigger delay to make it disable right after it enables, so you're only having this like weird kind of activation with the zone entering the players. But this is a great way to create an instigator where there wasn't an instigator. Because there are a few things in creative where there just isn't an instigator. Like, something can transmit even if nobody was really activating it. For instance, you could have a storm. Storm is just gonna start when Storm might just start when the game starts, and then when the phase ends, it's not going to. There wasn't a person that ended the phase. The storm just ended because of the time restraints. And you could have that enable this mutator zone, and then it will transmit 4 players rather than just. You could have this storm controller enable the mutator zone so that it transmits 4 players rather than just transmitting for nobody as it would normally. Things like, for example, if you want to use the triggering players on the item granter, or if you want to do something like giving people a health power up, which could be a good idea, I guess. Let's say you had a certain class, that you wanted to get a health power up every time a phase ended in like your Zone Wars map with classes or whatever. Kind of like Volcano. Well, Volcano uses teams, but we'll get into that. Let's say you had that. So we'll set this mutator zone to only affect, let's say class 2. Then this, on phase ended, can transmit to the mutator zone. The trigger here is just going to make a small delay. We'll do 0.25, although it could probably be much longer and still work since the storm phases aren't going to be half a second apart. I would not rely on triggers for most delays though, unless they're very small, because if you have a mechanic where you might have separate delays for multiple players at the same time, you wouldn't want there to be any interference. But a trigger device can only store 1 timer, whereas with an actual timer device, it can be running separately for as many players as you want at the same time. But we can talk about that later. The whole point of the trigger here is that it's going to disable this mutator zone, so it can re-enable again when another storm phase ends. And then of course you want the health power up to pick up, not spawn or despawn, pick up when they enter the mutator zone, even though really the mutator zone was entering them. The other thing with health power-ups is that they actually aren't the best at activating for a ton of people at the same time. This is true with like any power-up. It's obviously good to make sure that it doesn't have a 15-second respawn time, so it does by default. Your remotely activated power-ups should almost always have an instant respawn time, unless you want them to have a respawn time for whatever reason. But what you're gonna do instead is set it to apply to everybody on the player's class. Well, I know this is definitely a lot. I was really trying to introduce a lot of things in one video, but if you made it this far, good for you. You're on your way to learning how to use devices in creative very well. In the next video, we're going to be talking about player attributes, so basically anything in here that you can affect, like health, shields, infinite ammo, all that good stuff, and how to control it with teams, classes, and how to kind of cheat the class system. It'll be pretty interesting. We're going to be talking about how Volcano Zone Wars does it and things of that nature. But yeah, that'll definitely do it for this one. I'll see you there.